This is extremely dangerous.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
It is, unless you make the most important decision of your life. Prove to yourself that you have the strength and the courage to be free. Become our elite peacekeeping force. See exotic new life forms. And spread managed democracy. Become a hero. Become a legend.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Our democracy. What a phrase, huh? Not just democracy, not a democracy, our democracy. Why does it sound so possessed? Like property, like a sacred object you defend instead of a tool that you use. And why does critique trigger the same reflex almost every time?
And immediately, Nazi!
We hear it constantly. Every week, another Nazi. Every disagreement, another fascist. Every objection, another threat to democracy. Most people think this is propaganda. It's cheap hysteria, a childish moral panic, and you expect me, of course, to debunk it, to say, no, of course not everyone is a Nazi. But what if it's not wrong? What if I'm going to do the opposite? I'm going to affirm it. Not in content, of course, but in structure, because the uncomfortable truth is that the way we perform democracy today doesn't merely allow totalitarian tendencies. It manufactures them. It trains them. It gives them moral legitimacy. It turns them into a default setting, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Thus the real question isn't who the real Nazi is. The question is what makes us accuse others of it. What system tickles it out of us? Because modern democracy, our democracy, is not the antidote to fascism. It is the incubation chamber. Now let's talk about the word our. When people say our democracy, they are not describing a neutral political mechanism. They are declaring membership in a moral body. They're saying I belong to this, and just as much, it belongs to me. It's their first spell, because once democracy becomes ours, politics becomes personal. Not personal as in I prefer policy A over policy B. Personal as in I'm a good person, and my politics prove it. Likewise, you are a bad person, and your politics prove it. The next election isn't just a choice, it's a confession. And this election isn't just an administration alone, it's a moral tribunal. Through this mindset, something very specific happens. Everything becomes political. Not because politics is actually involved in everything, but because if the state is us, then anything we do becomes a contribution to the greater. If everyone is a participant, then everyone becomes a cell inside of a communal body. But if everyone is a cell, then every action becomes political. What you eat, what you say, what you joke about, who you date, where you live, and what you believe. All of it becomes political, because you're no longer a person in a society. You're a functional unit inside of a collective project. That's why politicians, just as well as influencers, by the way, don't say that the state did that. Instead, we say that we did it. We chose that, we are that.
Wir schaffen das.
This is the very point where democracy stops being a method of choosing leaders and representatives and becomes a method of manufacturing a moral we. A collective identity, a spiritual organism. You see it in slogans, in tone, and in that smug little implication that if you disagree with me, you're not just of a different opinion, you're wrong in a deeper way. Disloyal, misinformed, malicious, or worse. Once politics becomes loyalty, the word Nazi becomes useful, because it's not just an argument, it is primarily a marker. Now, of course, when I say that everyone in a way is a Nazi, I'm not affirming the low IQ troglodyte that thinks everyone is literally Hitler. Spare me the kindergarten. I am, however, saying something much worse. The accusation survives because it matches the shape of the system. Everyone is a Nazi isn't only a smear, it's a confession about the political environment. It reveals that the environment itself has become so totalizing that it only interprets conflict in existential categories. Instead of disagreeing about tax policy, you treat the other as a threat to a sacred order. Instead of disagreeing about border policy, you're advocating for violence. Instead of disagreeing about cultural norms, You're deranged, degenerate, and dangerous. All of this isn't by accident. It's what happens when democracy is experienced as collective self-ownership, when the state becomes personal, and when the political we becomes an organism. Inside of an organism, any opposition isn't normal, it's a disease. Disagreement stops being debate and becomes betrayal, contamination, and sabotage. That's why Nazi is the easiest word in the world. It converts opponents into pathogens and caricatures. But once you do that, anything becomes justified, your evil becomes necessary, your cruelty becomes protection, and your censorship becomes safety. Thus the real question isn't who the Nazi is, the question is, what kind of system makes people believe that this is a rational decision? The answer sits underneath modern democracy like a reactor core. It's total participation, the fact that everyone can vote. See, the modern mind has been trained to believe that universal participation is synonymous with freedom, and even with success, hence the participation trophy. We are all winning if we all do something, even if the something is barely anything. More voting equals more liberty, and more participation equals more legitimacy. More inclusion equals more safety. That's a childish equation. We all know this. Forced voting is often used by dictatorships to self-legitimize, and including the incompatible creates anything but safety. Yet we keep treating total participation as holy. Here's what it really does. It fuses the person into the state. It doesn't merely give you influence, it declares your ownership. And this ownership changes psychology. When the state becomes something that you own, you defend it. And thus, when the state becomes something you create, then you justify it. When the state becomes something that you vote into existence, you become implicated in its outputs. You don't just have preferences anymore, you feel a moral responsibility for the collective machine. And then humans do what humans always do when implicated. They defend the machine, they rationalize the machine, they sacralize the machine, and finally they demand that it validates them. We demand that it proves that we are good. All of this is why modern democracies don't really feel like administration or dignified councils of free men. They feel like moral theater, because everyone is invited on stage. Everyone in a way is a co-author, and if everyone is a co-author, then anyone who refuses the script becomes the villain. Just think, for example, about the deportation theater we witness now. One administration does it quietly, another one makes it cinematic. Federal agents staged like action figures, victims staged like saints, both sides harvesting footage like it's a sacrament. The theater of the strong militarized federal agent makes conservatives feel validated. Finally, somebody is doing something. Meanwhile, the image of the victim polarizes the other side and sanctifies their rage. Both sides get their dopamine. Both sides get their religion. When this was less politicized, however, you could actually deport more people with less fuss, and it wouldn't even become the main moral storyline of the month. But now it has to, because everything has to be translated into moral theater. Herein lies the key. Once the political body is imagined as total, then you demand total alignment. That's how our democracy turns into identity, an identity that is always hungry. It always needs enemies, it always needs traitors, it always needs purification. That's exactly why we need to step backward for a moment, because all of this isn't just psychological. It has a metaphysical architecture to it. There is a hidden grammar underneath the modern political imagination, and it has a name. See, most people have never really read Hegel, and it doesn't really matter because he's a pain in the ass to read. Most of you, however, still speak his language, because you don't need to read a man for his metaphysics to become the air that you breathe. Hegel's core move is very simple. He treats contradictions not as a condition of life, but as the engine of history. Conflict is not something that you manage, it is something that you overcome into a higher unity. He imagines humans to be a mirror through which God can affirm himself. The system he uses to get to this affirmation is called dialectics. In very plain terms, a system generates its opposite. Then the clash is resolved by producing a synthesis that preserves both of the parts while reorganizing them into a higher order.
Not how fucking dialectics works, you stupid cuck! I didn't study Hegel, plus continental philosophy in general, at Harvard for 7
This is the very
fucking
logic
years.
that modern minds internalize without knowing. For us, a contradiction is not tolerated, it is pathologized, and it has to be solved through integration into a larger whole. The psychological consequence is that pluralism, so differing ideas, away from this thought, become morally suspicious. Because pluralism affirms that different people can want different things permanently and without needing a final resolution. Hegelian grammar, however, cannot accept that. In this idea, disagreement is not a stable reality, it's an error, on the way to completion. If you disagree, something must be wrong. Misinformation, irrationality, bad faith, or pathology. Here the religious punchline really matters, because for Hegel, synthesis became salvation. Unity becomes a virtue and completion becomes the moral horizon. Now if we apply this to politics, you get the modern day, in which the collective will becomes higher than the individual. The individual is no longer the primary unit of reality, he becomes building material, history becomes a subject, and society becomes an organism. The state becomes a moral form, more than just administration, more than law. It becomes a destiny machine, a vessel, a stage where the spirit unfolds and becomes conscious of itself. Oh, you can already see where this one goes. If you believe history is a movement toward higher unity, then limits look like sin. Borders look like regression and local loyalties look like selfishness. The small and peculiar, they look like a problem to be dissolved or crushed. Now Hegel is the crucial link to understand the two following ideas. On one hand we have Karl Marx, his brainchild once through a lot of current day. In its shadow there is Gentile, the spiritual father of fascism. These two grow out of this exact grammar, like two different cancers growing from the same tissue. They disagree on the costume, but they share the very same addiction. Marx takes Hegel's dialectic and flips it into the material world. He throws out spirit and says that the engine is economics and class. The underlying structure, however, stays identical, no matter how much Karl Marx will tell you otherwise in his books. In his dynamic, just as well as in Hegel's, contradiction drives history. The resolution is a final synthesis, a closure, a completion. The end of history. The Marxist endgame and all thoughts that come out of it is a hypersynthesis by removal, to abolish the structures that generate difference and contradiction, like for example unequal distribution of wealth, or class, private property. There will be no mine, no local worlds that resist the universal. The dream is a smooth humanity for smooth brains. It is a final condition where conflict is no longer structural because the structures that produce conflict have been dissolved. It's the same metaphysical hunger, the abolition of the partial, the local, the person, of you. Gentile, on the other hand, doesn't dissolve the collective into a universal mush. He concentrates it, no pun intended. He takes the very same Hegelian thinking and pushes it into the nation-state. It is a hypersynthesis by concentration. Not everyone becomes one humanity, but we become one people, one nation body, one will, one destiny, and one Austrian painter with a severe meth addiction. Gentile's move is terrifying precisely because it's clean. The state isn't merely an instrument, it is chosen by the people. The people become actual only through the state. Thus the citizen and the state interpenetrate. They become the same thing. This is why Gentile himself describes fascism as a democratic state par excellence, because the state becomes the ethical reality. The individual becomes real by participating in the collective will. It's still our, but now our is absolute. Oh, doesn't that sound all too familiar?
And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Within these two ideas there lies a single truth that we don't really want to understand. These are not opposites. They are siblings. Both are religions that compete over the same religious impulse, completion. Marxism and fascism are both completion machines. They both hate the messy person. They both hate the stubborn particular. They hate you. They both hate the world of limits, because limits interrupt synthesis. Limits refuse the end. Limits imply that life is not a system, but every system hates what it cannot totalize. This is why the system hates you. Under this metaphysical regime, politics collapses into a binary eventually, into two states. One is the erasure of all boundaries, universal dissolution into the final collective of losers. The second one is the culmination of all boundaries, one nation body, one super identity, One collective will focused into one big superiority complex. Here lies the spell that we are all under. If you reject this dissolution, you get shoved into the other side. If you refuse the global homo endgame, you're branded as the Austrian painter's apprentice. Because the system only recognizes total trajectories, it cannot recognize limits as legitimate, it cannot metabolize bounded pluralism, it cannot understand the small, it cannot understand you as a higher civilizational unit. So when someone refuses dissolution, they're not argued with, they are branded, because within this grammar, refusal is not just a position, it's a sabotage of destiny. All of this runs so deep that even the tools that I use here to analyze and trace back totalitarianism are often rooted in the very same totalizing psychology. The modern mind has been trained to interpret politics as grand moral drama, cosmic narrative, historical necessity, and thus even when you oppose totalitarianism, you have to do it in totalitarian terms, with fanatic zeal, absolute moral language, a holy war frame, and thus you fight a religion by becoming a priest of the counter-religion.
Miami, maybe these Jews and women and blacks aren't so bad. But then they prove me right. My former life of hatred and anti-Semitism is completely vindicated. I am doubling down. More anti-Semitism, more Hitler, more racism, more sexism.
You drag your child to a protest like a sacramental offering, just how Hamas positions their rocket batteries next to schools, and then you pretend that you're shocked that the world feels like a holy war. Of course it does, when you make it one. This is the structural truth behind all of it. Everyone is a Nazi. Not literally, but in a worse sense. Our environment is constructed to make us proto-fascists eventually, because it demands involvement from everyone, and thus the system seeks to involve itself with everything. We are living inside a political machine that forces everyone into total positions over time. It's not that everyone wants camps, it's that everyone is being pressured into Nazi-esque politics. Politics that can only speak in absolutes, purities, destinies, enemies, and final synthesis. The content changes and the structure remains. It's why both fascism and Marxism are revolutionary. That's why we have bureaucrats role-playing as revolutionaries, because they are, not against the system, they are slaves to it, but on behalf of a metaphysical project. That you have to dissolve boundaries, enforce synthesis, and complete history. The framework has never changed, even though the Nazis lost the war. We in Germany, we thought changing colors and atoning was enough. How wrong we are. Nazism and fascism were defeated militarily, socially, and symbolically. They lost, and Marxism, fittingly of course, defeated itself. But people confuse defeat with refutation. You can outlaw symbols without outlawing the psychological architecture that makes those symbols inevitable. If the architecture remains, it repeats itself, not because one idea is stronger, but because they belong to the same category. The post-war liberal democratic order didn't remove the totalizing impulse, it repackaged it. It made it polite, and it made it procedural. It made it moral, and it made it our democracy. That's why we get the structural repetition. Not the same uniforms, not the same slogans, but the same metaphysical pattern. It is the same axis. Politics as moral salvation, opponents as enemies of the greater, history as destination, contradiction as pathology, and synthesis as the only acceptable future. So no, the antidote isn't another victory, it's a redesign. And this redesign has to begin with heresy. Here is what you're not allowed to say. Total democratic participation is not inherently good. Maybe one person, one vote, is not a magic spell that produces legitimacy. Maybe universal suffrage, especially when performed as moral identity, fuses the person into the state and makes totalitarian psychology inevitable. If you cannot even consider this possibility, then you're not defending democracy, you're worshipping it. This worship does something to you. It collapses your soul into your opinions. You can't separate yourself from your politics anymore, because your politics are now your proof of being good. You're not a citizen with preferences, you are a moral avatar. I'll say something borderline unspeakable. The state cannot and should not be a rational actor in the way that modern ideology pretends it is. Because service and loyalty to your fellow man can never be truly rationalized. A fireman or policeman risking his life for another cannot be rational. When this separation collapses and the state becomes a rational entity, then our democracy stops being a tool and becomes a reason, an end goal. It becomes a self-validating organism. See, allowing millions into Europe under false pretense might be good, because maybe we can replace the missing birth rates with new people, or maybe we can finally erase national boundaries into a bigger system. But just because it makes the number bigger doesn't mean one should do it. All of this is not moralizing, it's just anthropology. Humans do not bind themselves to a purely rational machine, and the ones who claim that they do are already inside of a belief. Humans bind themselves through meaning, ritual, oath, symbolic form, duty, the irrational. If the state denies this, if it pretends it's just procedure, it creates a legitimacy vacuum. This vacuum then gets filled with idealism, grand narratives, moral crusades, history with a destination. It is why we don't have great leaders anymore. Because all these qualities, like loyalty, honesty, principles, those are not optimized outputs, they require irrational commitment. If you don't consecrate duty openly, you get ideology as substitute religion. Once the state tries to claim legitimacy through collective will, you're done. Collective will rests on consensus, and consensus is a hungry god. It will demand total agreement. It will expand participation not to liberate people, but to justify itself. It needs everyone involved because everyone involved makes the mirror brighter. Oh, doesn't that sound familiar?
I'm retarded?
Hegel thought humanity was a mirror for God. Modern democratic ideology, however, turns society into a mirror for the state. It is a permanent self-validation mechanism. The system must constantly look at itself and say that we are good, we are legitimate, we are the people. And anyone who disrupts the mirror becomes a threat, not because they're wrong, but because they break this spell. We need to arrive at a point, either the end of history or the Austrian painter. So the answer to all of this, the only way out that I can think of at least, isn't another self-validation mechanism. The answer is the opposite, not a hunt for what has to be, but an affirmation of what is. Limits, duties, bounded loyalties, ritualized legitimacy, local trust, and a state that serves instead of metaphysically transforming its subjects into itself. And thus we return to the bookend. Our democracy. Now you know why it sounds so possessed. Because it is. Universal voting is a Faustian bargain. It turns legitimacy into a shared identity. It makes everyone a stakeholder in the moral output of the state. It fuses person and state. And once this is fused, politics demands total narrative unity. Because if the state is us, then the state must be morally coherent. And coherence at mass scale requires purification. Enemies, traitors, the end of contradictions. Which means modern democracy pushes towards two stabilizing endgames. Option A, the global homo maxing. Erase difference until no contradiction remains. Option B is the Austrian painter 2, electric boogaloo. Crystallize identity into one super entity. Choose your path, Western man. I want to, however, propose the first step toward a third option. The only one that isn't a completion machine. And it starts with bounded pluralism. Not borderless mush, not total concentration, but pluralism with limits, sustained by duty, ritual, and local trust. A world where politics returns to administration and stops pretending to be salvation. I will thus say something that might be unspeakable. Voting should and cannot be treated like a sacrament. It should be treated like a responsibility tied to a service. Voting has to be earned through service or duty, some form of demonstrated stake beyond just mere opinion and passion. Not because I want less democracy for its own sake, but because I want less possessive democracy, the kind that turns every citizen into a co-owner of the moral machine, and therefore turns every disagreement into treason. A service-based franchise does something the modern system cannot do. It introduces ritualized legitimacy without ideology. On top of all of this, I think that people that work for the state should never be able to vote for it. A system like this will tell you that you're not entitled to rule merely because you exist. You participate in rule because you have demonstrated duty. It creates a citizen class that is bound by obligation, not just appetite.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
They're doing their part. Are you? Join the mobile infantry and save the world. Service guarantees citizenship.
It reduces the theater, because fewer people are psychologically invested in the state as a moral mirror, and it restores what the completion machines hate: the small, the particular, the local, the finite person. It restores you, because it leaves you alone. This is why the system cannot tolerate bounded pluralism. The small does not generate mass consensus. The small does not generate the illusion of a unified will. We are all different, aren't we? And thus, the small does not feed the legitimacy hunger of the abstract state governed by losers or narcissists, or both. And thus, you get smeared. You get branded reactionary, and then inevitably
Nazi!
But now you understand why I affirm the accusation structurally. Because within this architecture everyone is pushed into Nazi-shaped politics. Not because everyone wants camps, not because everyone is a monster, but because the system forces politics into total positions, and if you refuse liberation, then you're cast as its opposite. At that point the moral machinery starts, accusation come, and thus if you made it to this point, congratulations. You are now holding tomorrow's most dangerous idea. If you want to explore it a bit more, I recommend the Father series, linked here. If you have your own take to share, or want to critique it, feel free to do so. Thank you for your time.